Contemporary discourse is witnessing a widespread discussion about the masculinity crisis, characterized by alarming statistics related to men's mental health, suicide rates, declining educational attainment, and social isolation. This context is what drives institutions like the American Psychological Association, APA, to rethink masculinity. This report presents an analysis of two primary models for understanding this issue. The APA's therapeutic social justice model. This framework diagnoses traditional masculinity as a source of psychological harm and prescribes a new model of healthier masculinity rooted in secular, therapeutic, and social constructionist principles. The Islamic theological ethical model. This framework, derived from the Quran and Sunnah, defines masculinity, Rujoolah, not as a social construct to be deconstructed, but as a set of virtues and responsibilities defined by revelation, which must be cultivated to achieve success, falah, in this life and the next. This report posits that although both frameworks identify real symptoms of male suffering, their epistemological foundations, definitions of health, and ultimate goals are fundamentally irreconcilable. The APA's model, rooted in secular humanism and critical theory, seeks to liberate men from traditional roles, whereas the Islamic model seeks to empower men to flourish within divinely ordained roles. The APA's clinical and ideological framework of masculinity, the diagnosis, pathologizing traditional masculinity. This section begins by deconstructing the central diagnosis offered by the APA. The term traditional masculinity ideology is defined as a constellation of traits including stoicism, competitiveness, dominance, aggression, self-reliance, emotional control, and the primacy of work. The APA's core argument is that conformity to these standards is on the whole harmful and is linked to a range of negative outcomes: reluctance to seek preventive health care and mental health services, higher rates of suicide, violence, substance abuse, and workaholism. To clinicalize this critique, reference is made to the Conformity to Masculine Norms Inventory, which identified 11 distinct norms, such as winning, emotional control, risk-taking, violence, playboy appearance, self-reliance, dominance, etc., illustrating how this critique has been operationalized into a measurable clinical tool. The APA's framework functions as a medicalization of ideology. The APA uses the language of clinical psychology and public health, e.g., psychologically harmful, negative health outcomes, to describe a set of behaviors and character traits. These standards, however, are not universally seen as pathological. In many cultures and historical periods, traits like discipline, stoicism, and self-reliance were considered virtues. By portraying traditional masculinity as a public health hazard, the APA elevates what is essentially a socio-political critique, rooted in feminist and critical theories, as noted by critics, to the level of a clinical diagnosis. This medicalization grants the ideological critique an authority and objectivity it might not otherwise possess, reframing a philosophical disagreement as a matter of health versus harm, where a differing worldview is treated as a symptom to be cured. The prescription, formulating healthier images of masculinity. This part details the solution proposed by the APA, the promotion of healthy, pro-social masculinities. The core components of this new model center on emotional connection, authenticity, vulnerability, and flexibility. The goal is to encourage men to discard harmful ideologies like violence and sexism while embracing positive aspects like courage and leadership, but only after they are reframed within the new model. The guidelines emphasize an intersectional approach, urging psychologists to consider how masculinity is constructed and experienced differently based on race, class, sexual orientation, and gender identity. This explicitly links the project to broader social justice aims. The ultimate goal is to achieve better outcomes for men, reduce suicide, improved mental health, and for society, reduced violence, greater gender equality. Philosophical foundations and inherent controversy. This section analyzes the deep-seated criticisms of the APA's approach. It highlights the argument that the APA is pathologizing innate components of masculine nature and treating them as symptoms to be cured, rather than as traits to be responsibly cultivated. It also explores the critique that the guidelines are based on blank state theory, the idea that any psychological differences between the sexes are purely cultural, ignoring biological and evolutionary psychology. The analysis includes the backlash from within and outside the psychology community, with critics arguing the guidelines are driven by a controversial ideological stance and that the APA is acting as armed combatants in the war of ideas. It also touches on the accusation that the guidelines prioritize societal benefit over the individual patient's well-being, potentially violating the Hippocratic Oath by treating the male patient as a means to a social end. The APA's Rethinking project risks creating a normative vacuum. The project's nature is fundamentally deconstructive. Its primary energy is focused on dismantling traditional masculinity. The proposed alternative, healthier masculinity, is defined largely in opposition to the traditional model and offered in vague therapeutic terms like authenticity and emotional connection. By delegitimizing an established, albeit imperfect, model of manhood without providing a robust, positive and compelling alternative, the APA may inadvertently create a vacuum of norms. This vacuum is unlikely to remain empty. It can be filled by more extreme and reactionary ideologies, such as the Red Pill movement, which has been critiqued from an Islamic perspective, that promise a clear, if distorted, vision of male identity to boys and men who feel lost and pathologized by the mainstream narrative. Thus, the APA's approach may, paradoxically, be fueling the very toxic behaviors it seeks to eliminate. The Islamic framework of virtuous manhood, Rujoolah. The Quranic and prophetic paradigm. This section establishes the foundational principles of masculinity in Islam. It begins with the Quranic premise of the spiritual equality of men and women, who were created from a single soul and are protectors of one another. It then defines the core concept of Rujoolah, manhood, explaining that in the Islamic lexicon, this term is not about biology, but about character and ethics. It denotes integrity, fulfilling one's covenants, courage, and standing for the truth. The related concept of muru'ah, chivalry or manliness, is introduced, defined by classical scholars as good character, generosity, humility, piety, and abstaining from base actions. This establishes Islamic masculinity as a fundamentally ethical and spiritual pursuit. The framework of integration is also explained. Men and women are equal before God, but have different, complementary roles and responsibilities designed to create societal balance. The prophetic model, a synthesis of strength and mercy. This section presents the Prophet Muhammad as the ultimate embodiment and ideal model of Islamic masculinity. It provides specific examples from the Sunnah, prophetic tradition, that show his perfect balance of seemingly contradictory traits, courage and strength, his leadership in battle and his steadfastness on principle, mercy and gentleness, his kindness to his family, helping with household chores, showing affection to children, and never striking a woman or a servant. Emotional intelligence and expression, his ability to perceive the emotional states of others, his open expression of grief at the loss of his son, Ibrahim, the eye sheds tears and the heart grieves, and his turning to Allah in moments of distress. This directly contradicts the APA's stereotype of stoicism. The prophetic masculinity is a holistic synthesis, whereas the APA's model is a fragmented set of approved and disapproved traits. The APA model operates by isolating certain traits, dominance, aggression, emotional control, labeling them as toxic or harmful, and advocating for their removal or modification. In contrast, the prophetic model does not isolate traits but presents a holistic personal paradigm. Strength is not toxic, it is contextualized by mercy. Leadership is not dominance, it is tempered by consultation and humility. Emotional control is not suppression, it is the mastery, hilm, required for justice and mercy. The Islamic approach, therefore, is not about subtracting bad traits, but about integrating all human faculties, strength, emotion, intellect, and directing them toward a higher purpose, the pleasure of God. The problem is not the trait itself, but its orientation and application. The burden of responsibility, chiwama as care, not domination. This part provides a precise theological explanation of the concept of chiwama, guardianship or responsibility. It will be framed not as a male privilege or domination, but as a heavy responsibility and a divine trust, aridamana. Chiwama is defined as the man's duty to protect, provide for, and maintain the well-being of his family. This responsibility is tied to specific capacities and is a functional role, not an expression of inherent superiority. The analysis emphasizes that chiwama must be exercised with justice, adl, consultation, shura, and kindness, ihsan, as exemplified by the Prophet. This ideal model will be explicitly contrasted with patriarchal cultural distortions that misuse the concept to justify abuse and control, practices that are un-Islamic. Comparative analysis of core tenets, shared concerns, divergent solutions, mental health and emotion. This section acknowledges the shared concern for the psychological well-being of men. Both frameworks recognize that men suffer from depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation. However, the proposed solutions diverge. The APA advocates for therapeutic expression and the deconstruction of gender norms as the primary path to healing. In contrast, the Islamic framework offers a multi-layered approach, spiritual coping, emphasizing patience, sabr, trust in God, tawakkul, prayer and supplication, dua, as primary sources of comfort and psychological resilience. Emotional validation, acknowledging that grief, sorrow and fear are normal human experiences, even for prophets, and that complaining of one's sorrow to Allah is a praiseworthy act of worship. Permissibility of seeking help. Islam obligates the preservation of health, making seeking professional help permissible and even necessary. Psychological struggles are not seen as a sign of weak faith, but as a test from God. The Islamic framework offers a God-centered resilience that is inaccessible in the APA's human-centered model. The APA's model of resilience is psychosocial. It relies on developing internal coping skills and external support networks, and its ultimate reference point is the self and society. The Islamic model includes these elements but adds a transcendent layer. Resilience is built not just on self-reliance but on God-reliance, tawakkul. Suffering is contextualized as a test from a loving God, which can expiate sins and elevate spiritual rank. This God-centered framework provides a source of meaning and hope in suffering that a purely secular, human-centered model cannot offer. It transforms a potentially meaningless psychological crisis into an event of spiritual significance, which can be a more powerful motivator for healing and growth. The semantics of strength, stoicism versus sabr. This part directly compares how key traits are defined and valued, using the comparative table as a central tool. It illustrates that the APA's critique often relies on a negative framing of traits that have virtuous counterparts in Islam. Stoicism versus patience, sabr and forbearance, hilm. The APA's stoicism is portrayed as a harmful suppression of emotion. In Islam, sabr and hilm are praised virtues of mastering one's emotions, especially anger, not to deny them, but to respond with wisdom and justice. The strong is not the one who overcomes people by wrestling, but the strong is the one who controls himself in a fit of anger. The former is about hiding emotion. The latter is about controlling one's response for a higher purpose. Self-reliance versus tawakkul. The APA's self-reliance is portrayed as a refusal to seek help, leading to isolation. In Islam, one is encouraged to be productive and not be a burden, but ultimate reliance, tawakkul, is on God alone. This fosters humility and makes seeking help from God and the community a natural and virtuous act. The irreconcilable conflict: gender, sexuality, and teleology. The epistemological chasm: social construct versus divine revelation. This section argues that the deepest conflict is epistemological. The APA's framework is built on the foundations of modern social science, which views gender as a fluid social construct. Its truths are contingent and changeable with new research and evolving social norms. In contrast, the Islamic framework is built on divine revelation, Quran and Sunnah, which it holds to be timeless and immutable truth. Gender is not a social construct, but a divinely created reality, fitra, with an inherent purpose. This difference in foundation, human reason and social consensus versus divine command, means there is no common ground on the most fundamental questions of what a human being is and is for. Gender identity and integration. This part contrasts the APA's implicit and explicit support for gender fluidity and non-binary identities with the Islamic view. The APA's guidelines call for sensitivity to gender identity and are part of a wider institutional framework that affirms transgender identities. The Islamic position, based on clear texts from the Quran and Sunnah, establishes a clear male-female binary as the normative foundation for humanity. While acknowledging natural variations in temperament, Islamic law prohibits the intentional imitation, tashabbuh, of the opposite sex in dress and mannerism, as this is seen as a violation of the natural order created by God. The conflict over imitation reveals a deeper conflict over the nature of identity itself. The APA framework advocates for authenticity, which is defined as the alignment of one's external presentation with one's internal feelings or identity. From this perspective, a biological male who identifies as female is being authentic by adopting female attire and mannerisms. The Islamic framework, however, defines authenticity as alignment with one's created nature, fitra, and the divine will. For a man, this means striving to embody the virtues of Rujoolah. Therefore, what the APA calls authenticity, Islam may describe as prohibited imitation. The very act one framework sees as the pinnacle of self-actualization, the other sees as a transgression of the natural order. This is a direct and irreconcilable clash of first principles. Sexual ethics and the LGBT agenda. This section addresses the user's query directly. It points out that the APA's professional practice guidelines explicitly include working with lesbian, gay, and bisexual clients, and the institution as a whole mandates an affirmative approach to diverse sexual orientations. The guidelines for men and boys must be read within this broader institutional context. This will be contrasted with the classical Sunni Islamic position, derived from explicit texts in the Quran and Sunnah. This position defines legitimate sexual expression exclusively within the covenant of marriage between a man and a woman. All other forms of sexual activity are considered major sins. The analysis concludes that on the issues of gender identity and sexual ethics, there is no room for synthesis or compromise. The APA's framework requires the affirmation of what Islam categorically prohibits. For a psychologist seeking to adhere to both the APA guidelines and classical Islamic ethics on these matters, it would be a logical and ethical impossibility. Critical reflections and recommendations. A devil's advocate inquiry, acknowledging legitimate grievances. This section adopts a nuanced and self-critical perspective. It argues that the APA's critique of traditional masculinity, while based on a flawed worldview, gains traction because it accurately describes distorted and abusive behaviors found in many cultures, including Muslim cultures. It will cite sources describing how patriarchal and masculinist interpretations of religious texts, which often conflate culture with Islam, lead to the very problems the APA identifies: domestic violence, emotional suppression, and the oppression of women. The core argument here is that Muslims should not reflexively defend all behaviors exhibited by Muslim men. Instead, they must differentiate between authentic prophetic manhood and its cultural corruptions. The problem is not Islam. The problem is the deviation from Islam, the failure of Muslim communities to effectively teach and embody prophetic manhood creates the very conditions that make secular critiques like the APA's seem plausible and attractive. When Muslim boys are raised on a cultural model of masculinity that emphasizes harshness, emotional suppression, and dominance, a deviation from the Sunnah, they suffer the negative consequences the APA describes. When they encounter the APA's framework, it resonates with their lived experience of this distorted masculinity. They see the symptoms described and accept the APA's diagnosis. And because they were never taught the robust, balanced, and emotionally intelligent prophetic alternative, they assume the only options available are the toxic cultural model they experienced or the secular therapeutic model being offered. Therefore, the most effective response to the APA's challenge is not merely a theological refutation, but a practical revival of authentic Rujoolah within Muslim homes and communities, thereby inoculating the next generation against both cultural distortion and secular ideology. A path forward for Muslim communities, reviving prophetic manhood. This final section provides concrete, actionable recommendations based on the report's analysis. Education, a call for the development of curricula for mosques, Islamic schools, and families on the Surah, life of the Prophet, with a specific focus on his character as a man, husband, father, and leader. Mental health, advocating for the expansion of Islamically integrated mental health services that utilize the rich resources of the Islamic tradition in emotional intelligence and spiritual well-being, while also employing sound clinical practices. This provides an alternative to secular therapy that may be hostile to Islamic values. Parenting, encouraging a shift in parenting away from harsh cultural norms and toward the prophetic model of raising boys who are strong and merciful, responsible and humble, emotionally connected to their families and to God. Community discourse, urging imams and community leaders to speak openly about these topics, reclaiming the discourse on masculinity from both cultural extremists and secular ideologues, and presenting the beautiful, balanced prophetic model as the true standard. Conclusion. The conclusion summarizes the report's key findings, reiterating that the APA's rethinking masculinity and the Islamic framework of Rujoolah represent two fundamentally different and ultimately irreconcilable paradigms. It will re-emphasize that they begin from different starting points, social construct versus divine revelation, aim for different goals, therapeutic self-actualization versus spiritual salvation, and offer contradictory prescriptions on the most critical issues of gender and sexuality. The concluding statement will assert that the Islamic tradition does not need to rethink masculinity, but rather to revive the authentic, comprehensive, and timeless model embodied by the Prophet Muhammad, which provides a complete blueprint for male flourishing that is both psychologically sound and spiritually fulfilling.